Associate Professor at Berklee College of Music's Music Synthesis Department in Boston. And just parenthetically, I was Director of Marketing for the old Moog synthesizer company for 3 or 4 years. So I have a pretty close bond to this idea about musical instruments. And today, I'm really not going to talk about some of the more abstract or avant-garde music that's been made per se. I'm more interested in showing some of the instruments because this is the part I think that fewer people know about. And in some ways, it's more romantic and more interesting in some ways. Uh, what is it? Lights?
It's one of those switches, two of those. There we go.
Ah, now I've traced things that use electricity back to 1759, and I find it quite interesting that the use of electricity in the arts probably predates the use of electricity for industrial purposes. This is Delabord's electric harpsichord of 1759, and those of you who are with an electrical background recognize Ben Franklin's repulsion system here, which he used for predicting, for indicating when lightning was in the area. It's an attraction repulsion technique, which rings these bells in a continuous basis from a keyboard. Here we see a detail where this little clapper is first pulled to one bell, then released, and then pulled to the other, and oscillates back and forth. You may be asking from the electrical folks, 1759, what the heck was the power source for such an instrument, since Volta didn't come along and do the voltaic pile, which we would think of as a battery, until 1799? Well, it was a Leyden jar. This was powered with static electricity. As you can imagine, those early centuries are necessarily sparse. There were some serendipitous things, and there weren't a whole lot of instruments like Delabord's electric harpsichord. We find, though, a number of things happening. In 1837, right down here in Salem, C.G. Page discovered the principle, in essence, of the electronic tuning fork. You can also see Rice's telephone having some relationship to Page's discoveries. And that was one of another early thing that was used for making a tone with something electric. Here we have a detail of something from 1899. This is Duddle's singing arc. I guess there's some argument about who actually invented this, but Duddle kind of got the credit. If you've been to State Fair, you've seen these very large carbon arc lamps, and if you get up close to one, you notice that it hisses. Well, it hisses at a frequency, of course. And if you put this shunt circuit around the arc with an inductor and a capacitor, then you can tune that. And this actually was built as an instrument in 1899, played, and it made the arc lights in London play tunes. So there's been a number of things along these ways that you can simply call serendipitous or came out of the laboratory, and there's many others. But against this backdrop of sort of experimentation and byproducts, there stands a tour de force in the 19th century, which is Thaddeus Cahill's telharmonium or dynamophone. This is Thaddeus. He and his siblings, brothers and sisters, both developed something based first on the commutator principle of interrupting electricity. And of course, as we know, to make sound with electricity, we must make alternating current. So the first telharmonium had these sort of commutators, a more mature version. Here's some Rhea cylinders, so-called. If you look, you begin to see first partial, second partial, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, meaning exact or harmonic. I guess it's as good as it gets. Excuse me a moment. All right. Harmonics. In essence, this is a Hammond organ. These are rotating tone wheels. More advanced versions use the alternator, but here is a Rhea cylinder for one note. Fundamental, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, 8, and 9. The 7th is missing for the same reason that it's missing in the Hammond organ, because it's out of tune with our equal-tempered system. So, well, why did we have to have a tone wheel this large? Because 1896 predates the advent of the amplifier, which was due to Lee DeForest, 1906, having improved on Fleming's valve of 1904. So the instrument was a tad large. Here's a man standing in the background. This is a small model. This is your demo version of this instrument. It was a trifle on the large side. This was an adventure in music that in today's dollars would be about a $20 million adventure. The idea being that you would pipe music into dentist's office, restaurants, and so forth in New York City. And as a matter of fact, this is a mixer, an inductor, as you see. Okay. It took a little wiring, of course, to get all the partials together and the sharing of partials and so forth. You're not going to do this. You know, this has got to be a roadie's nightmare. I mean, now this is played even before the electrodynamic speaker. We see these kind of strange speakers up here. We see this early kind of keyboard here. This is a touch-sensitive instrument, a velocity-sensitive electrical instrument in 1896. Basically, which lasted all the way up into 1918. And I might add that Arthur Cahill kept the prototype telharmonium in storage in his garage for 50 years, trying to find someone who would take it as an artifact of our history, and the Smithsonian nor no one else took it. It is now to oblivion. One of the sad stories about this entire effort that we live in an era of seemingly inexhaustible ways of preserving things in all sorts of ways, and yet we have not done that.
Does anybody know what happened to it at all?
Oh yeah, its demise is chronicled very well by Reynold Weidenauer's dissertation from NYU of a couple of years ago. I reviewed that dissertation in Computer Music Journal from a year or so ago, and you can certainly buy it from. Well, it's out on Scarecrow now. He made a book out of it. It's out on Scarecrow. And essentially the Panic of 1907, which was a financial upset in the country, spelled its demise. But it had its technical problems, and there were, of course, what are you doing? You're putting out a 15 kilowatt signal over a wire. You're going to have a little bit of an inductive field around that, and you're going to be messing around with J.P. Morgan's phone conversations, which is one of the apocryphal stories. We don't know if that's true, but it certainly led to its swift departure. Of course, the problem would not have had anything to do with telephones because radio was just around the corner, and the idea of having something that weighed 200 tons that took 10 rail cars to carry, which quite literally, it was installed in New York City in 1906. From Holyoke, Massachusetts, it took 10 rail cars to carry it there. So it was the most spectacular failure from which a great deal can be learned in a historical sense. This idea of a rotating tone wheel is an extremely important idea, which eventuates in its most successful manifestation as the Hammond organ, with little half-dollar sized wheels going around. Of course, now you have amplifiers. Now, in the teens, there was something called a chorale solo, and this is kind of an interesting reverse. The tone wheel actually makes a frequency that is used with an electromagnet to drive a string, kind of like an electric guitar in reverse. And as a matter of fact, some of the things that got driven with little pieces of metal attached to them were glass rods, aluminum rods, all manner of some other kinds of things. So here we see this very important principle of electromagnetic phonic wheel, the scalloped edges changing the flux in the air gap here and causing alternating current, and there must be thousands of designs like this, the most important of which was the Hammond organ from Lorenz Hammond, which came about in 1935. An interesting part of the Hammond story is before the Hammond company was an organ company, it was a clock company, 1925, and their clocks kept good time because they were synchronous to wall current, which means they had a reference of wall current. And the organs used the same thing, and of course there was a gear train for all of the little wheels in the equal tempered system, so the internal tuning would stay in tune, and the overall tuning would stay in tune because the same motor was used in the Hammond organ that was used in their clocks. If you go to old country post offices, you can still find these big wooden Hammond clocks, very large, encased.
Before you turn that off,
Sure.
we have a 1936 model.
Oh wow. That's quite early.
Do you want it?
Oh, absolutely. Yes,
It's still in storage.
I'd love that. Yes, very much. Thank you. Yeah, that's quite early. That's quite early. There's a huge history with the Hammond Organ Company. A lot of fun stories, but to try to get through a lot of this, as you can see, and I don't remember who all these people are. It seems to me that that's Fritz Reiner. Does anybody know? That looks like Reiner from other things that I know. These are lions of the legit music world here. In almost every case, when an instrument came out that was new, example given the theremin, it was really taken quite seriously by the intelligentsia, by the cognoscenti of the music world, and so forth. Almost inevitably, it would get exploited and then fall to a kind of a B-grade movie status, as we know, which has beleaguered electric instruments. But this is Hammond in the very early days, in the 30s, with some of these important personages from the music world. Here's R.H. Ranger, who brought some of the first tape recorders, he and Jack Mullen, back from Germany. And earlier, Ranger had done such things as the electrified NBC, the chime, and here's his Ranger tone of 50,000 separate parts, which it had rotating tone wheels. About the same year, about 1937. Here's Aramaeus Gnome from Philadelphia, again, rotating tone wheels. This is an additive synthesizer from the early days, another attempt to make music with sine waves. Here's some more Aramaeus from WCAU radio in Philadelphia. This woman is sitting on a piece of metal, and she is part of the circuitry. As you see here, there are no keys there, movable keys as such. It reminds me sort of a Buchla synthesizer, if you're familiar with that, from the voltage-controlled era. That from about earlier actually, 33. Well, another important principle that we see, and we may see come back because light, of course, is becoming much more important in our telecommunications ideas, the concept of interrupting a light in front of an electric eye in a very coarse sort of way of explaining this. A light chopper, this will make a particular kind of waveform that alternates. Selenium was tried. Several elements were used for these kinds of things. And of course, it was the basis of film. The early film that worked, that had a soundtrack, was photographic. It was photoelectric. Of course, there was Vitaphone, which was a synchronized turntable and so forth, but it really didn't last. So if you look at the history of electronic musical instruments, you see that inevitably they are piggybacked on some other technology, mostly radio, sometimes film, sometimes computer. We didn't even have our own digital to analog converter for electronic musical instruments, basically until the CD came about. So that's another one of the things that you come to understand. It's a very tiny industry. This is the Photona from WCAU. This too from about 1935. It used 900 automobile lamps to excite, and these are all the whirling dervish wheels. These would make pulse wave kinds of sounds primarily. And then Welty in Germany had the idea of phonograms, and a number of other people have done this. For those who are not familiar with waveforms that are somewhat smooth are simpler in character and have fewer harmonics or partials, and these which are spiky are brighter, having more partials. But these are on the periphery of a wheel, and it rotates in front at a certain angular velocity, and of course you get a frequency then. And Welty had hoped to have all the sounds of the pipe organ in Germany, the wonderful pipe organs, on these glass discs. Of course, it was ruined by the war, and all the existing models are gone. Here's the detail of the super piano from Spielman. Here he is. This is a sampler, if you will. It's a sampler. It's certainly not digital, but it's analog. It uses the same photoelectric or photographic technology. And they understood completely what the ramifications were. They knew that if you played a violin down low, that you'd get this shift, and you'd get this timbral shift, and so forth. This is Austria in the 30s. These are all then photoelectric instruments. Here's the cellulophone from France from about the same time, mid-30s. Oh, this is one of my favorites, the radio organ of a trillion tones by Leslie and Samus. They had also, this rotating tone wheel, they'd also done a model which actually pulled celluloid film strips by a reader, like a film strip for each key, sort of like a mellotron, if you know from Moody Blues and some other instruments did this with electromagnetic tape. They had done this in the 30s with film for use with commercials and cartoons and things like this. The Hardy Goldthwait has the distinction of having one of the first electronic musical instruments that actually had a patron. Somebody actually paid to have this built, the photoelectric. Here's a detail of Aramaeus Centronic organ, which Leopold Stokowski, the famous conductor at Philadelphia, Houston, and other orchestras, had put out an ad in 1935 saying, in essence, we're going to have an orchestra of these instruments. And the musician, the head of the musicians union, wrote him a letter and said, Maestro, we wish you wouldn't do that. To which Stokowski acceded. He said, okay, fine, I won't do that. But the idea there for an electrical orchestra was quite early and in popular science. You see that ad. Here's a rendering of what the instrument would have looked like. Again, photoelectric, like a big loop with pitch tracks and timbral masks. Now, here's this idea from Aramaeus at WCAU of synthesis. You can see this from an old magazine article with the dot patterns. The violinist plays, the engineer over here puts the picture onto the video scope, and the artist then renders this by hand. Daphne Orme and a lot of people have actually done hand-drawn sound, and it's not beyond comprehension. Norma McLaren in Canada, a number of people have used a technique like this. And then there were literally hundreds of ways of taking this information and somehow getting it into a media that would move, whether with gears, cams. This brings to mind the Whitneys, doesn't it? If you know the Whitneys music, the famous filmmakers, the Whitney brothers, who had cams that moved in interrupted light, and they put that directly onto film stock and then played it as though it were some kind of a recording. So there's a precedent for almost everything that you hear and see. You begin to realize it's very difficult that something would be new. Here's Oscar Vierling. In Germany, a lot of things are going on in Europe about this time, and you see this exemplifies a very important principle. In architecture, there's a cliche that form follows function, or some people think it should. And in music, this has pretty much been true, that if you want to make gong sound, well, you have to have something quite large. It has to be made out of metal. It has to be curved a certain way. It has to be a certain thickness and so forth. The form of the thing in acoustic instruments must follow the function, but not so with electric instruments, because we have this breaking up, this etherealization of the physics of the situation. There's no body to this cello. You don't need one. So you just need a pickup for the strings, and then you can do what you want electrically. Of course, this is exactly what our slab guitars are in rock and roll right now, isn't it? And with pickups, the non-hollow body type guitars, the slab guitars. Here's the Neo Beckstein from Germany, an electric piano of the time, about 1935. The electric chord by Nernst, Vierling, and Forster. Some very famous people, physicists, were working in these areas. I think that's Dame Myra Hess playing one of these electric instruments.
Well, it certainly is her hairdo.
Yes, it is, isn't it? This is a sort of an interesting instrument from France, the radiotone. It's an update of the medieval hurdy-gurdy, where you rub a string, and it's done with a piezoelectro pickup. Piezo type pickup. Here's a very important gentleman, Benjamin Franklin Meisner, and it's a patent attorney, C.T. Jacobs. And here we have the piano, and as you see, the knobs, if you put strings, pickups along a string that's vibrating, well, of course, we know it vibrates in nodes and loops, and you could pick up different harmonics along the string at different places. This is used on guitars, too. You have several pickups that make different sounds, bright, dark, and so forth. And these are for sort of tuning up the sound that you want. So there was a whole spate of pianos in the 30s. Here's Meisner's mini piano for rock and roll, hey, for club dates. Here's an electrostatic design. Oh, here's a nice marketing story. Everything that was electric was essentially radio in this period, no matter what it was. Phono, speaker, radio, musical instrument. Of course, you want your all-in-one home entertainment center. I mean, that's the only way to go, isn't it? Now, these are some interesting instruments that were used in an orchestra in 1939. Here's your indispensable Hawaiian slide guitar. If you didn't have one of these, you didn't work in some of these eras. This very important influence: violin, bass, cello, double neck guitar. Mostly Meissner instruments that were played in the Craycraft All-Electronic Orchestra of 1939. Here is Tom Adrian Craycraft with his mixing ensemble. Here's a gentleman playing the Hammond Nova chord, which came out in 39. Here's a Meissner mini piano. And here are all these other instruments, including, of course, the indispensable Hawaiian lap guitar. Here's Mr. Meissner at his home in Short Hills, New Jersey. He was also the inventor of the Wurlitzer piano, which you can hear on Carpenter's, early Stevie Wonder, just all kinds of pop influence there. Now, we leave the period then of the moving part for a moment and look at Lee DeForest's design for an oscillator. Now, many people think Fritz Lowenstein or other people invented the first oscillator, but DeForest got his name on the patent. And here it is, and as I recall, this is from, I think, 1915. These little devices here are markings with a graphite pencil which act as a resistor, and as you play this, you can actuate this. You go through different resistances, which of course is one of the ways to change the pitch. The round device up there is a triode, which is the basis of amplification, and of course, as we know, amplifiers are capable of feeding back. The principle of feedback brings oscillation, so essentially the electronic era is ushered in, first with Tom Edison with the Edison effect in the 19th century, then Fleming in 1904 with the diode, and Lee DeForest in 1906 with the triode. So, of course, like all eras, musicians began to experiment with the latest technology, exactly as we were doing today. And as in all eras, they're probably into some very bad habits. And here they are playing their ordinary lab-type oscillators, and they've marked notes on the front of these things, and they're trying to make some sense out of these kinds of things. Here's Dr. Miller's voice chord of 1916. Very, very early, a polyphonic instrument, like an organ. Here's the WRNY Stockatone, WRNY New York, with 25 diaphragms and a single horn. So named the Stockatone because its envelope was a rectangle. It had no attack or release control. This was designed, by the way, by Hugo Gernsback. You've heard of Hugos in science fiction? The Hugo is for Hugo Gernsback, who was quite an editor and a person who popularized science in the early part of the century. Now, the ways of solving some of the problems of the era were, in many ways, more interesting than what we have now. Here's a sort of a little short keyboard in tiers, because each manual or clavier was monophonic. This is Mager in Germany in the late 30s, playing a four-note instrument, three here and one on the pedals. He later devised electronic sounds for Bayreuth, for the festival for Wagner. And some of the expression devices were quite useful. Here is a situation where as you press the key up and down, you modulate the strength of a coil, and you can therefore have vibrato if you wish, and so forth. Now, in the same way that a pipe organ can have thousands of pipes, then you think as a homologue, something that functions in the same way, the vacuum tube oscillator would have thousands of vacuum tubes. And these kinds of instruments were designed and installed in large cathedrals in Paris and many other places with literally thousands of vacuum tubes as the operating devices. On a more experimental vein, we have the Hertzian in Germany with Hellberger and Lertis. You see Lertis's book from 1930 in German. You notice there are no keys here. Many of the early instruments had these band manuals, like the old, at the Moog Company, we had something called the Moog ribbon controller. And if you've ever seen a video of Keith Emerson, he would do obscene things, with this ribbon controller with various postures and so forth, but it had a little ribbon on it. And I think that pretty much came from this tradition. Well, why a ribbon? Why not a key? Well, because these tubes warm up and they cool off and they go out of tune. And you just can't segment them into equal temperament, they won't stay in tune. One oscillator goes this way, one oscillator goes that way. So, like a violinist, you have to do multiple triple stops and so forth in these early days. So you see this sort of technique, which brings about a totally different trajectory of play. One of my biggest gripes with the industry right now is it's keyboard based. It's keyboard based. That's only one trajectory. And in the old days, there were many things tried, and we need that sense of experimentation again. Here's the Lurtzian in concert. And now we get up to a point where we can hear a little sound. I brought half a dozen things along. Inevitably, when something is new, there's a period of experimentation, it seems. Then there's a period of exploitation, and then there's a period of decadence. I think we have that every 30 years with electric instruments. The 30s, profound experimentation. Troutwine, Martineau, all kinds of people building strange and wonderful instruments. And then the 40s, push button and get a sound. The clavivox, the solovox, the clavioline, the onduline, all of these little push button instruments. And then in the 50s, with the exception of the RCA being kind of an interesting thing, it's pretty much decadence. Then in the 60s, again, you got this tremendous flowering again with Boucle Moog, Paul Ketolf in Rome doing the Senket, and all kinds of other people doing strange things. And then in the 70s, you've got exploitation and push-button things, and then again in the 80s, you've got decadence. And I hope we're in the 90s now, we're back to some experimentation. This particular little instrument, if I could back up and play you just something, and this is not meant to be music literature as such. This is a pretty rude example. It's from cartoon music, but this is from the clavioline. Notice how colorful these filtered sounds are. Now, what you hear, of course, right there, the reason there's color, these moving sounds, this wah kind of an effect, is in essence you've got something called a formant that moves. Now, this contradicts what happens with acoustic instruments. Acoustic instruments have these formants, these areas of emphasis. You sing in a bathroom, it favors certain notes. You play a bassoon, it favors the frequencies around 500. You speak, you say E, you've got formants at 3K and some other formants lower. Areas of emphasis. And basically those sit still. But when you can move them around, now you've got something that people haven't heard from acoustic instruments, or they haven't heard it from the voice. And I think therein lies the early fascination, possibly, with those kinds of sounds. They go all the way up into the modern synthesizer, this kind of wah-wah.
That's a Hammond case, isn't it?
Where's this? This one?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's have a solo box. I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. Here we go. Yeah, that's a Hammond solo box. It's a monophonic instrument that you put up under your piano keyboard and you play cocktail piano, but you play electronic stuff with your right hand. Came in 3 models, J, K, and L. And monophonic, little tiny keys, and very, very popular for its day. Yeah, sure. This comes from about 1939, something like that. Which, this is a polyphonic version of that. This is the Hammond Novacord. Now, Ferdy Grofé took 3 or 4 of these and a Hammond organ and entertained for a year or more people at the New York World's Fair in 1939 and so forth, at the Ford Exposition, because Ford was one of the first people who ever bought a Hammond organ. So that was the New World Orchestra. Here we have, once again, another orchestra from about this period of total electric instruments. This is a very sophisticated instrument, too. It's one of the very first where you could take your hands off the keyboard and the envelope would die away slowly. The end or release of the sound and the attack could be controlled. This is kind of not an idea that you have with a pipe organ. This is kind of a new idea as people come thinking about musical instruments. And of course, the one note one tube, one note kind of idea, sort of thing like that, eventuated in things like this consonata, which came about right before the Second World War. And now back, let's look and see what's happening in Europe a little bit. We've got the theremin. Now this is an instrument that can be played exquisitely or terribly. It reminds me of the old joke about what's the ideal instrumentation for saxophone in the wind band. 3 and give one of them a reed. Sorry for you. Hey, I love the saxophone, but probably not in the wind band. Probably not in the wind band. It's great when it's in jazz and rock and roll and stuff like that. Anyhow, here's the theremin. Now this has the distinction that it's an instrument you play without touching. It has these fields around these antennae, and you participate in these fields, and your body has electrical characteristics, and your body becomes part of the capacitance inside of the instrument. Your body has capacitance, and as you enter these fields, it's capable of sensing. Now, I'm fortunate to have heard and helped make a videotape on Clara Rockmore, the premier theremin player ever, who this was developed in 1919, but came to this country about 29. It was a radiophonic instrument. See, this is a radio if you want to think of it this way. You think about heterodyning in radio and you realize this is a beat frequency instrument. 2 oscillators at 200,000 hertz, and one is detuned to 201,000 hertz, and you hear then the difference to 1,000 hertz. So this is an instrument that's capable of the gamut, as it's called, from the lowest possible pitch to the very highest possible pitch, which once again, form doesn't follow function, does it? You can't have something that plays all pitches with physical things. There's certain sizes, and because of that, there's constraints. This has nothing to do, by the way, with aesthetic considerations. It doesn't make them better because they're higher, faster, louder, and so forth. It just makes them remarkable. Here is a very uptown kind of recital. This is Theremin himself. That's Frank Chatterton, his accompanist. And this woman over here is who became Clara Rockmore. At this point, she's Clara Reisenberg. And she and her sister, Nadia Reisenberg, the famous pedagogue, the pianist at Juilliard, immigrated from Russia. Clara was a Leopold Auer student, a violin student, and became a theremin player. This is the speaker. Here's an orchestra of 10 theremin players at Carnegie Hall. Yeah. I can't imagine. As we say down south, it must have sounded like a dying calf in a hailstorm.
They look like they got square head out of
Yeah. Yeah, it's always interesting to look back and see what people took extremely seriously at the time. Now, when you have a marketing success, RCA actually decided, hey, what a hip thing. Let's build theremins. The RCA company, pretty big outfit. Oh, I don't know, maybe they built about 200. And but their logo was interesting, and this is what has infected electric instruments from their inception. Their logo was, anyone who can hum or whistle is likely to play it as well as a trained musician, which is absolutely true because trained musicians can't play it well. Which they certainly found out almost instantly. After all, I don't know how long your arm is, but you've got a 5-octave range from the end of your shoulder out here to here. 5 octaves. Where is C sharp 3? Oh, it's about there. Where? Okay? It's a very difficult thing to play. And I want you to listen to this woman that's doing this keyboard theremin, big marketing success. And of course the theremin cello, which Wallingford Rieger played on a few days' notice. And of course the terpsitone, the theremin dance stage on which you stooped and rose and played. And it's reliable that someone danced the Bagunot Ave Maria at Carnegie Hall on one of these things. Now, besides the rather, comic elements of this, there really is an artistic element to almost anything that you can play and play well. Let's see if we're where we need to be to hear Clara play a little Saint-Saëns here. Oh, I wish it were that simple. Clara has worked out an aerial, what can I say? Yeah, more than, I mean, she has an absolute taxonomy for scales. She moves her fingers to play notes in the air. I've heard her play habanera. And yes, the triplets that come down. Oh yeah, she does that with her fingers. And everybody else plays theremin like this. And that's why it sounds the way it does. I mean, she literally developed a technique for playing this instrument. And this, of course, is what's wrong today. We have not married the performance tradition with the new possibilities of electronics. Oh, well, I play synthesizer. Yeah, why? Well, because I play piano. That's not the answer, folks. It really isn't. When you look at these artists from the past, you begin to realize there's some unique trajectory and some new technique and something different that needs to be done. And perhaps it's not even a keyboard. There's something else that needs to be explored. Oh, well, she has perfect pitch. And yes, you're right. I mean, if you could possibly get your violin students to phrase that way.
How are the dynamics controlled?
The dynamics are controlled with the left hand in that loop.
See?
And the pitch is controlled with the right hand with the rod standing up like this. So there's two fields. And as she moves her hand into the loop, it quiets the tone. So to make an articulation, raises the hand like this. It's not all cantabile like this. She can play more staccato. I've heard this. I've been in her apartment and watched, and it's like an amazing feat. And her sense not only of pitch, but think about the kinesthesia involved with this. When she plays Stella, like, what is that? I guess it's Stella, just right there. Bang! She knows just right where it is. The big intervals have to be with the arm. But the small intervals are these hand movements through the air like this, so you get this. And you're getting these incredible runs and things like that. Yeah, it's a far cry from Lothar and the Hand People, okay, who also used the theorem. And it became associated, of course, with B-grade movies. That's right, when the werewolf is going to bite the girl on the neck. Our outer limits. We know that in space, things don't sound the way they do here. That's what Hollywood has told us. They sound very strange in space. And so since people hadn't heard these sounds, they had to associate them with something that they didn't know about, which inevitably was either horror or dementia. You get the theremin in Spellbound. You remember Spellbound? Who was it, Gregory Peck? No, not Peck. It was one of those.
That's who it was.
Yeah, and Ingrid Bergman. No, it was. I never know these movie stars, but some of those big time movie stars. And I've got the video, but the people aren't really interesting. The theremin is. Yeah, I mean this is some real artistry, and later, of course, it was too hard to play. So along comes Maurice Martineau in about 1928 says, well, I'm going to take this same principle of heterodyning, this beat frequency principle. I'm going to change capacitors as I move this celluloid ring up and down a dummy keyboard. There's no keys here, just paint on the early instruments, just paint it on. Then you take the finger in the celluloid ring. Now you've at least got a reference for where C sharp is like a trombone. The length has always been associated with music, the length of the string and the trombone, the length of the tube, and these kinds of things. It's very organic that Martineau came along and did this. He did something even more important from the standpoint of the design of instruments. He bifurcated the functions. Here's the pitch selecting function. Here's the pitch articulation function. Now on a keyboard example, I've got nothing against the piano. I think it's a wonderful instrument. However, in a matter of degrees of freedom, you're missing something. The same thing that articulates the note is the same thing that selects the pitch. On the tenor saxophone, the things that select the pitch are not the same things that articulate the note. Ergo, you can go tie-ta-ta-ta, tie-ta-ta-ta. You can slur two and tongue two on the tenor, and you can't do that on the piano. You can play legato, but that's not slurring. So whether you do it with a synthesizer, a piano, or whatever, that interface itself dictates certain possibilities, and especially when it's polyphonic. But what he did is he put a button over here that was touch sensitive and some tone color controls, and one hand did that, and the other hand played the pitches. And at first it was the dummy keyboard, and then it came with a more sophisticated keyboard a movable keyboard and the ring for portamento. It had its own voice, its own speaker, the palme or métallique, and a little gong with a driver behind it for certain kinds of sounds, and this for another kind of
You
sound.
could only play melodies on this.
You can only play melodies on it like the other 400 instruments in the world that you can only play melodies on. And the dozen or so that you can play polyphonically, you lose the degrees of freedom of the individuality. That's my thesis. That when synthesizers came, you can only play one note, and the keyboard player hated that. And then Tom Costner, Jan Hammer, Rick Wakeman, Keith Emerson, George Duke, all of these people got up in the front of the band and soloed and became very famous. As soon as synthesizers could play chords, they went back to the back of the band, go back and comp, go back and play textures. Yeah? No matter how much you can burn on a piano, it's not like a wind instrumentalist, in my view. You don't have the same degrees of freedom. The most important of which is the bending of pitch, which the ear hears best. I think it's built into our psyches. I don't think it's just accidental that pitch is extremely important. We hear it best. Of course it's important. What's also important here is it has its own voice. Most of the community of electronic instruments has been seduced by hi-fi. Let's hook up our synthesizers to a transparent PA. No, my friends, no decent guitar player in the world would do that. No rock guitar player would do that. Hey, I'm going to play Mesa Boogie. No, man, I'm a Marshall man. Oh, yeah? No. Fender. That's what really kicks. It has its own voice. So why shouldn't electric instruments, instead of the generalized voice of, quote, PA? This is where we begin to lose it. These guys had the right idea. And we begin to lose it from there. Listen to this excerpt and see how wind-like it is. This is an ensemble of these en Martineaus. It's several of them playing. They're all monophonic instruments. Yeah, see, you've got some.
Strange string chords.
Yeah, exactly. But you've got this sense of articulation that's continuous and variable, rather than discrete, a la most of what MIDI provides. This is heresy, right? I teach MIDI. I teach this. So, in Germany, and I've got to quit editorializing, we'll never get out of here. Here's Traum. Here's the Trautonium, another very important instrument. I'm sorry for this being, I can't focus it. It's out of focus from the photo. It's touch sensitive. It starts off being touch sensitive in the 30s with mercury, believe it or not, underneath, something that Harold Bode used later. Here's an early experimental model. And once again, we see there's no keyboard here. These are little dummy keys that show about where the keys are. And there's strings. There's electric strings, in other words, to play on. I've heard Oscar Sala. I had to travel into what we used to call behind the Iron Curtain to hear Oscar Sala play this instrument. I heard him play things like Paganini Caprices on this thing. Two hands. And he wouldn't let me record him. He wouldn't let me record him in an interview, and he says, no, because my English is not so good. Absolutely insisted. So I tried, but we'd be talking, and then he burst into German, and I didn't understand a word of German. I took statistics instead.
What is the pedal doing?
Oh, this is volume, this is loudness. And look how it works. Look at this. See what this is? It's a bellows. You'll find a lot of pneumatic technology, of course, associated with these instruments. The first synthesizer had bellows and had piano technology, player piano technology, because that's the kind of things you have on these player piano things. So this is the same kind of thing. You see this interesting merger of the mechanical and the electronic, as you would expect. This time, now I've got a little excerpt of this. It was built by Telefunken in some small numbers. Once again, a disastrous marketing experience. And here's Sala in his early days with the Telefunken Trautonium, and it was played. And there's several concerti written for this. I don't have one along with me, but there's in the 30s there were a number of serious works written for this. And here's Mr. Sala with his improved version, the mixture Trautonium, on which he's done hundreds and hundreds of film scores and sound effects. I might add, for instance, you remember Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. Those cracking and kind of cawing sounds from the birds are all done on the mixture Trautonium. And many, many other things that you've heard. You've heard this instrument probably dozens of times and just weren't aware of it. You see something about the technique. These little dummy plastic keys, sometimes he would put his finger on and wiggle those, but most of the time he's just playing up here. Now, this is overdubbed. He's not playing all of this in one pass, the thing I'm going to play for you, but he's playing it in real time for the overdubs. He's playing this. This is not some kind of a studio trick. Oscar Sala. Yeah, that's technique, isn't it? Yeah. That's truly.
How does he do that? Not with a keyboard.
Right, it's on two wires. One here and one here.
Amazing.
Yeah. Yes, it is. To see it is even more incredible, as seeing Clara. I do have a videotape of Clara, which would be of interest. And there was a thing done for Studio 3 in New York, a half-hour program, which it might be possible to get someday. Oh, somebody turned the light back on. Be careful. With the little switch that slides up that says be on fan. It goes up. It's on fan to the highest. Thank you. Now, we're really not going to dwell on musique concrète. I suspect more people know about it than know about some of these other things, and some other time I could come back and we could talk about a lot of things. This is Pierre Schaeffer, he and Pierre Henry, the two Pierres, 1948, Music of Noises, the radio ORTF, and this established the idea of the tape recorder basically as a musical instrument, not just to hold sounds, but a device through which to edit sounds and to refract a certain mentality about music. Noise collage, which of course did not originate with Schaeffer, the futurist in Italy, and Dada, and all kinds of things. But what's of interest possibly to me is the machines that were in there. This is the phonogen. This too is a sampler. You put a loop of tape in here, an endless loop, and these capstans all run at different frequencies, each of which is proportional to one note of the equal tempered scale. As you play down here, if the tape says woof, you can play woof, 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 woof. Like this. This is your basic 1950s analog sampler using tape rather than something else. And this tape tradition comes to the United States in the persons of Vladimir Usichevsky and Otto Luning. Luning is still with us. He was at Bourges a couple of years ago and just as sharp as ever. And so you get this manipulation of instruments primarily from these two in the United States. In France, It was concrete, literally, sounds, subways, railroad cars, things like that. They were more interested in manipulating the sounds of instruments on tape. And one of the key things that happened to sort of stimulate this was the development of the vocoder by Homer Dudley. This is a device that can make things talk. It puts the timbral characteristics of one signal onto the pitch characteristics of another signal. This is where you get your by your command, your basic Cylon warrior, and things like that. You know, you get your wonderful things this way. And you see, Homer Dudley goes to Germany, and he sees Meyer Epler, and Meyer Epler sees the vocoder and begins to think, because he's a phonetician at the university. And he begins to think about this, and it eventuates in the Cologne studio, actually, not Stockhausen. Inke builds it, Meyer Epler thinks of it, Imert runs it to begin with, and some of the more famous people came along 3 or 4 or 5 years later. And it's interesting to see the perspective from both directions here. This is a mixing desk. That's not really of tremendous interest, although it's kind of funky. And over here, though, is, now which is which? Yeah, here's the Trautwein monochord. You remember the Trautwein Trautonium. This is a similar type instrument. And here's the Boda mellow chord over here. Well, now Harold Boda then was to do in 1961 a tape loop machine that was modular that was to inspire Bob Moog to do a modular synthesizer in 1964. So here we have the past with Trautwein and the performance instrument, and what's leading towards the future or the modern age, something that's moving toward the synthesizer, right there in the Cologne studio. This is Stockhausen, who became the leading exponent of that studio and some of the festivals and some of the schools. And this is from Utrecht, Holland. It's a little studio, and to illustrate that the first electronic music studios, the so-called classical studios, there was nothing built for music. This is possibly faders from a radio station. This is some kind of a patch bay. It looks like a Den patch bay. These are ICO signal generators, probably, or some other brand, and various other devices up here that had nothing to do with music. This just sort of had to be patched together to make music. So this is the early classical studio. This is a much more sophisticated tape studio in Utrecht, in Holland, the Sonologie, which no longer is there. I'm sorry again about the quality, but these are historic materials. This is Jerry Hiller's studio from the University of Illinois, and Lejar Hiller moved on to UB, where I knew him when I was at the Moog Company. And this, again, is a kind of an elaborate classical studio, mostly tape manipulation. Against this, we see Max Matthews, the father of direct digital synthesis. Again, people probably know this a little better. I don't have an example, although I've got the original tape where it sings Daisy. Oh, do you remember that in 2001? That's fine, Hal. Would you like to hear my song? Yes. Yes, Hal. I'd like to hear that. Daisy, Day, and on. Why, how did they ever think of that? How did they ever think of a computer singing Daisy? Must have been a historian around. Well, you know, you've got these P fields and so forth, and you can stipulate music. This is a very cerebral way of thinking about music, and the results are, once again, this is an interesting saw too. Theoretically, direct digital synthesis can make any sound that's possible. To which my rejoinder is, yeah, and if my aunt had wheels, she'd be a wagon. Now, what can be done theoretically and what can be done realistically? Okay, I love this stuff. I have a lot of literature like this. I know what it can do. I also know that if you sit down with a funky Fender Rhodes piano and just play one chorus of blues, it would take you a blue moon to synthesize that in C sound. Okay? So, again, it's not a knock on C sound. It's just trying to get people to realize, okay, sure, my infinity is bigger than your infinity. Yeah, infinities are funny things. There's an infinity of even numbers. There's an infinity of odd numbers. And they don't have a damn thing to do with each other. Can I say that here? I can say that at Berkeley. Okay, good. They don't have a damn thing to do with each other, do they? Yeah? This infinity, that infinity, hey, it's like two different infinities. And yet they're both infinite. So, I've been in the infinite business forever because I sold this stuff. Yes, sir, we got an infinite synthesizer here. Yes, it will do anything. It'll perk your coffee. It'll tune your car. It'll do just about anything. And that was another infinity. It was an infinity of what you could do with a sawtooth. That's an infinity. The Hammond organ had 256 million tonal combinations, all of which sounded like a Hammond organ. But it does have that infinity. So we got to be careful with our infinities and realize, I think, no. We don't need infinities and we don't need digital audio workstations. We need some tools. The oboe. What? 2-octave range? What is 20 dB? Help me out. What a 20 dB dynamic range? Something like that. It's very narrow. It doesn't go too low. It's very narrow range. And yet, oh yeah, melts your heart. Now that's a tool. That's a tool. We need some things like that. We need a toolkit. Here's computer music installation. Now we're going to talk about synthesizers a little bit. Where do they start? Well, what is a synthesizer? Webster says the composition of elements so as to make a whole. Well, that implies a kind of a control over all the elements it takes to make a composition, to me. You see this starting in 29 with Couplot, Givlet. In France, you see the ubiquitous triode. It's a vacuum tube instrument. It's got pneumatic expression devices, and it's got, very important, a binary coded score. Player piano, paper tape. Punch, not punch, 0, 1, and so forth. Like MIDI in so many ways. As a matter of fact, player pianists from the turn of the century had velocity along the edge, just like MIDI has velocity for its notes. It's been around a long, long time. So here we have the contraption itself at the 1929 Paris Exposition. Now, which one is Couplot and which is Givlet, I haven't found out yet. But I will. And as you see, some of the expression devices, they're pneumatic. They're basically for player piano technology. It's kind of reasonable that this would happen since it preceded electric technology. Here's a very fascinating instrument. This is a score. These are graphite marks, and this is a reader. Now, most of the encoded paper tape things, the RCA, and we'll see in a moment, and so forth, you had the machine sit still and the score go past the machine. No. Not here. We have the mountain going to Mohammed. We have a 60-foot-long table on which you place the score, and the reader rolls across the score. Now I ask you, is this ergonomics or what? It does have some advantages. You can certainly look at the whole score. I can't think of another one. But this was done by Hannert at the Hammond Company, believe it or not, once again. This is from about 1945. The electrical orchestra, so-called. And, the tragedy of this is, they never record themselves, do they, these pioneers? It's too much to expect that they would do it. They're doing the pioneering. When I saw Gottfried Michael Koenig at Utrecht, I said, what about those wonderful machines that some of the tape loops, where you put these machines together to play? Oh, he says, they were thrown in the canal. They were cannibalized and thrown into the canal. And I turned to him and I said, over here in Vienna, they put Beethoven's and Mozart's pianos behind velvet cordons. And where is Varèse's tape recorder? Yeah. We have been profligate, should I say, that's maybe not the right word. We've been extravagantly negligent in our century in failing to document what has happened. We're on the cusp of something it's strange. 5,000 years of acoustic instruments, form, following, function, and now we've got these weird electric things, and it's like, well, okay, who cares? 100 years from now, people are going to be astonished at how short-sighted we were and said, my God, could they at least have made a recording of the thing? The remaining recording of the Hannert Electric Orchestra is 6 versions of Wagon Wheels. That's it. That's what we have as its legacy. I know that experimental things were done with this. I know that the Telharmonium could have been recorded. It went all the way up into 1907. We certainly had cylinders at that time. Yeah. There just wasn't anybody around, and there still aren't enough people around to realize, yeah, we're losing all these artifacts. Yeah, this is some more of the Hanner. Tubes, tubes, tubes. Here's weights on the keyboard. You can play from a keyboard, you can play from the score. What are these? These are large pots, I think. Potentiometers, I think that's what those are. Or they're cans for capacitors. There was an early use of drawing the waveform idea, and of course we had that on the Fairlight synthesizer, and of course anybody that knows anything about the time domain knows that, hey, you know, all smooth waveforms sound alike and all jagged waveforms sound alike. Once you get one little pulse going up this way, you have almost an infinite spectrum of harmonics. You can have just a little one that you don't even see too well, and it still sounds real bright. And the idea of drawing waveforms and correlating them with some sort of isomorphism to what you have in your head or what you hear is a specious idea, basically. And it's been proven over and over and over, but each generation has to learn it anew. So when the Fairlight came along, the guy showed me, he says, look, you can draw your own waveforms. I said, I give a damn. Oh, I can say that. Yeah, okay. All right. I give a damn. I don't care. I don't want to draw my own waveforms. It doesn't work. Then there were other ways. Percy Granger and Bernard Cross had done this thing called free music, of which there are a few extant examples. And there is a museum down in Australia, I'm glad to say. Here's the RCA synthesizer, which became very famous with Milton Babbitt and a lot of other people over at Columbia Princeton at the studios there with avant-garde music. But before it was famous for avant-garde music, Olson and Ballard, its designers, actually designed it to do pop tunes. And then later they changed their tune when the Musicians Union raised such a ruckus and, hey, RCA's got too much to lose. They gave it to Columbia Princeton and said, no, we were only kidding. We were never going to make pop tunes with it. I have the LM 1922, the experimental album that was put out for this instrument. This is not a very good copy. This came from an old tape. I've actually got a better, but I haven't been able to transcribe it. Well, what do you see? The paper tape, it plays two notes at once. Here's a Scully lathe that literally cut discs. See this? Different areas of the disc. This was your basic disc multi-track system when it started out, and then it went to tape a little later. So here's the RCA synthesizer. May Irving Berlin forgive me. That is a toe tapper. I mean, when I hear that, I just have to move around, I'm telling you. I mean, but this is what the Musicians Union got all in a big uproar about. Now, I was a member of the union for 20 years. I'm not anti-union, but you can say that if you want to. You can even tell Lee Berg. He'd like that. Is this being recorded? Okay, thank you. Okay, so here we are with the RCA. Tons of people have used it. Charlie Warren won a Pulitzer. What was it, Times Zirconium? Yeah, he took the RCA. Interesting how technology stamps itself on you. I went up and I saw this thing and I talked to Mr. Babbitt. You know, I interviewed him, all this stuff. Very, very generous man, a wonderful man. And I looked at some of these scores, and of course they're paper tapes and they got little dots. It turns out to make a long note on the RCA, you can't just code, give me 8 seconds of this. The feelers that feel things, they go from one dot to the next. That's how you would sustain a note. So you had to put dot, 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 dot. I mean a hole. Hole, down the page. And did you ever wonder why a lot of those pieces are pointillistic? Boop, 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 dip, 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 dang, dang. Why aren't they? Because you'd make confetti out of your score. Your score would have no physical stability, would it? And so it's like so many things happen this way that we're just not even aware of it. We're not aware that the technology, the devices that we use, we don't implant our personality on them. They implant their characteristics on us. There's a whole science called unobtrusive statistics. Like in grocery stores, you go around and you find out where the floor is worn more. And you find out things about. Have you ever noticed when you go into the grocery store, you always go through the produce section first? Do you think that happened by accident? No, no, no. No, there's a lot of interesting things like that. Here's Raymond Scott. A lot of people know Raymond Scott, especially if you're as old as I am, from Lucky Strike Hit Parade. Remember? His brother was Mark Warnow, and Raymond was married to Dorothy Collins. And he did the Lucky Strike Hit Parade first on radio and then on TV. And every week it was like, here's tune number 10. It was sort of like Casey Kasem 20 years earlier. Here's number 10, here's number 9, and they did a little scene, and Snooky Lanson was there and all this business. But after that, Raymond, who's a wild and crazy guy, was developing interesting electronic instruments. Some of the first artificial intelligence, long before MIT and long before the academics were doing this, Raymond Scott was doing it. 3 years before John Cage did 4 minutes and 33 seconds, Raymond did a silent piece with his sextet. It was the Raymond Scott Quintet. He didn't like the word sextet. It really was a sextet, but he didn't like the word, so it was a quintet. But he had done a silent piece 3 years before John Cage had done 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Sometimes it matters the venue that you're in as to whether or not people will remember you. He has 200 ASCAP tunes he's passed on about a year ago. Ren and Stimpy, that cartoon music, all this kind of stuff. And there's a reprise of his music now out on CD. Raymond had built something called the Electronium. Now, I went over to 3 Willow Park Center when I went to see Bob Moog at the Moog plant when I was first doing my dissertation research, and he says, well, you got to go see this man named Raymond Scott. He did the first jingles, singing commercial for Pepsi Cola. He did all this stuff. You got to go see Raymond Scott. So I went out and saw him, and this is what I confronted. It looked exactly like this. Here is the actuator for the entire instrument. One micro switch. There's a drum memory, I guess it's of a generation of about the IBM 650. Somebody correct me. That's about the 60s, something like that. Pretty primitive stuff. This is a huge sequencer, an artificial intelligence machine where, and I saw Raymond do this, where, give me a theme. No, I don't like that. Let me have another one. Okay, augment the intervals. Yeah, okay. Augment the rhythm. No, do a diminution at this point. Just by flipping these switches. And while Wendy Carlos and people were doing switched on Bach and these things one note at a time and layering it on tape recorders, Raymond was developing these incredible montages of sound with a little micro switch. Because he had this memory and he had this concept that, it doesn't matter if I get exactly what I want. I know I can do that. I've got 200 ASCAP tunes. I know I can do that. He was interested in the collaboration between the composer and the machine, and I'll bet not many people have heard of him. And he's just one of those unsung figures. Back here, you see some really strange stuff, this Manhattan research stuff. This is not part of the instrument. This is the instrument up here and underneath. And back here, one of the first sequencers that was ever done before Buchla, one of the first in-trigger delay a trigger as many times as you want to, a trigger meaning something that actuates a sonic event in the context of synthesizers and so forth. Yeah, an incredible man. He told me one time, he says, human beings are quivering organisms. And he told me, he says, I hate electronic music. I said, yeah, but that's what you're doing, Raymond. He says, no. No, he says, human beings are quivering organisms. You listen to the sounds that I'm making, and they've got this shake, they've got this movement, and they did. He said he had a doctorate in primitive engineering, which meant to me he was a genius. I do have some excerpts. Unfortunately, I don't have anything along with me. Here's the voter. You've heard of the expression, she can make that thing talk? Well, she certainly can. And at the San Francisco World's Fair and the New York World's Fair, the same where they had Ferdy Grofé for the Ford Company playing Hammond Notochords, over at Bell Labs, they had this cadre of women that played these voters, which is like a performance vocoder, if you will. And this key would have formant change, and this key would say tss, 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 for sibilants or fricatives and so forth. And down here, you'd have a volume pedal and a pitch change and this kind of thing. And they could make them talk. And this is part of the ongoing effort that's happened at Bell Labs. Now, we do have another excerpt here. Here's Hugh Kane. This is really very, very early, from about 48. It's very synthesizer-like, prior to the Moog synthesizer. This is called the electronic sackbut. Right. Now, I also use this as an example with my students that inventors should never play their own instruments. Get a professional, right? That's you playing. That's you playing. And of course, it's comical. I mean, but if you're a historian and you're listening to this, then you hear things that don't have anything to do with music at all. You hear, oh, there's portamento going on there. Boy, that sure isn't like any electric organ at all. There's portamento. There's a moving formant going on there. That's kind of an interesting idea. Acoustic instruments don't do very much of that. There's a timbral shift. There's vibrato that's under control. It's not just wow, 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 like organs where, on an organ you play through the vibrato, don't you? On wind instruments and violins, you can't vibrato at the same time you're changing hand position. So by virtue of the way the interface works and the musician's technique has developed, you get an idiomatic style which essentially says you only vibrato longer notes. That has become then Western music's one of the keynotes of our music because of the interfaces of the instruments. It's quite useful to think about instruments in degrees of freedom, which is a concept that acousticians and physicists and people like that. If you think about them in aesthetic terms, you can never come to any conclusions, frankly. The organ has fewer degrees of freedom than the bow arm of the violin. That's a true statement. It has nothing to do with whether or not you like pipe organ music or think it's superior or better. The violin sounds this way or that. It's a fact that there's 9 degrees of freedom with this thing, and there's 3 or 4 with this thing. And there are some ramifications for what you can do sonically because of these degrees of freedom. Oh, here's Ketoff in Rome and John Eaton. John Eaton from Indiana University, and this is the Simcat, which Eaton used for microtonal playing, and it's got an album out, several albums out on, I think it's Decca, and quite interesting music. It's electronic. It was actually a precursor to what we think of as the synthesizer. This is John Eaton playing it in real time. And here's Harold Boda. I promised you that he had this influence on Bob Moog. Here he is with his metal chord. This is from the Cologne studio days, which are like mid-50s. But by 1961, he developed this device with a tape loop, an endless tape loop, a tape recorder, and all of these modules, ring modulator, filter, processors basically, but it was modular. And Bob Moog told me specifically that when he saw this from Harold Boda, it absolutely determined that the Moog synthesizer would be modular. Now here's Bob Moog playing the theremin. Here's another contact and context of how these things happen. He made his way through Cornell selling theremin kits. He played the theremin as a child. And he, of course, came back and did this album with Clara Rockmore. That's produced by Bob and Shirley Moog. So here's Bob with his one of his models of theremin. And then here is the first mock-up, or the prototype, literally, of the Moog synthesizer. Generator and amplifier, that's all there was. VCO, VCA, that's it. That's how it started. Herb Deutsch acted as a catalyst in doing this, but many other people had a hand in the development of the ADSR envelope generator. Was an idea that came directly from Vladimir Ussachevsky by letter to Bob Moog. Why don't you have an envelope generator? Why doesn't it have 4? Gustav Chiamaga, the low-pass filter, and different elements like that. Many people had something to do with the Moog. Here was the first keyboard. The first keyboard, by the way, was polyphonic and was rejected as, well, this is just an organ. Well, let's do something different. So by the time voltage control came along, there was something different. And so here we see the very first prototype and the keyboard, and then the second generation modules, which established the style that we see on Carlos's album and many other things from the mid-60s onward. This starts from 1964. This is the brochure that Bob sent out in the summer of 1964, the very first offering of this new thing. And as you see, that is the prototype. That's not the second generation. Here's the second generation, which he took down to the AES show in New York and showed. And the very first customer was Alwyn Nikolai, the choreographer. And there's a wonderful album out of Nikolai's early Moog stuff. It's available now. There's much more historical consciousness happening now. This is Robert Moog, and I'm not sure this is at the AES. I've forgotten. It's at certainly at an early trade show. This is, well, it can't be the AES because here's the Boda frequency shifter, which came later. So he and Harold entered into business relationships as well. I thought you might be interested in seeing what the original Moog factory looked like in Trumansburg, New York. When I first met Bob Moog, the upstairs was his. This downstairs, he had the display, but there were some other things back over here. And we crawled out on a little roof out here, so there was no room to talk. So we crawled out on a roof, on top of the roof, and I interviewed him out there. And then I had to go to New York, of course, and see people like Eric Sadeh, who had done the old ABC logo on the El Martineau, and Eric Raymond Scott, and all these kind of mythical figures from this era. This, of course, is that's a Model 55 Moog synthesizer. You patched it together. Here's Robert Moog receiving his Grammy Award for Outstanding Technical Achievement in the late 60s. This is the old downstairs studio at Trumansburg where many people came and learned analog synthesis. The old MRS tape recorder, which was voltage controlled. The programmable 950 model of keyboard where you could dial up each note. It was microtonal. Walter Carlos became Wendy Carlos due to a transsexual operation. This is a picture of the person as Walter. I never knew this person as Walter. I've always known her as Wendy. But what happened is she put out Switched On Bach, and it literally revolutionized. It told people, oh, you can make pretty music. You can make pretty music with a synthesizer. And then it got into rock and roll. And as the rest of it, as we say, the rest is all history. Let me play you a little blurb. This was actually an advertisement from the old Moog company. If you don't know what these analog things sounded like, this is an example. This is not Carlos's work. Now that is put together literally one note at a time on a multi-track tape recorder using a monophonic instrument. Oh, who's this? Oh, that's Tom Rhea. I don't know who this guy is. Oh, it's Keith Emerson of VLP. A lot of people came through the Moog plant, both avant-garde, rock, jazz. Teitelbaum was there, Miroslav V2, Jan Hammer, Zappa. Everybody came through the Moog plant for one reason or the other because they were interested in this new thing, this tremendous energy that could come pouring out. And I was fortunate to work with a number of those people. This is the B model, Mini Moog. The D model became something that a lot of people used. Here's Jan Hammer. You may know him from Miami Vice. He had a life long before Miami Vice. He did the music for that, but he was really an ace monophonic keyboard kind of player, and he did that with Mahavishnu, the incarnation of Mahavishnu, Billy Cobham playing drums, and McLaughlin, and was Jerry Goodman with him? I can't remember. At any rate, there's Dave Luce with the Polymoog. Dave had actually worked in this area with Mel Clark and done some radical instruments in the 60s, some incredible sounds on one of a kind, not a synthesizer, dedicated modules that would sound like a horn or a violin or so forth. He developed this very, very early polyphonic synthesizer that was touch sensitive. This is Subotnick with Bukla's electric music box modules. When Moog was doing voltage control, Donald F. Bukla was doing voltage control on the West Coast in Berkeley, California, as Moog was doing it in Trumansburg, catering to a different market in general. Peter Zinoviev and David Cockrell, some people over in London, had the EMS. Here is Al Perlman, once again from the Boston area. I think that's Hugo Montenegro, yes. And this is a large 2500 modular system from our cherry picker bus bar matrix for interconnecting modules rather than patch cords. That's Mr. Perlman again with his 2600, which became quite popular with many artists. This is a young Stevie Wonder. Mr. Perlman again with some of his other instruments. Herbie Hancock. And these instruments started getting less expensive and more portable and more oriented towards performance. This is Max Matthews' Groove situation, which was a computer-driven control of this kind of voltage-controlled era. Some of the details of that. Here's some oscillators and a rack of equipment, not too distinguished. And then along we come with the sampling with Ray Kurzweil, and we have some instruments, and I'm purposely not talking about the modern era as much because it's the one that people know the most about, essentially. The idea of digital instruments. Just reminding people, though, that sampling, we have the Mellotron from Chamberlain and then others in London who improved on it. These are tapes hanging down, and as you play a key, it plays the tape. And when it gets to the end of the tape, it stops. It's 8-second limit on playing notes. Here is a nice instrument called the Lyricon. If you know where I can get one, please let me know. The Lyricon 1 especially. I forget the name of this thing from Germany, but the idea that at least there were some stabs at experimental kinds of things. This is called the Trezor. It's an X, Y, Z. You press on it for Z, you get X and Y control signals. This is something I did at Occidental Chemical Company. I say I did it. It was my idea, and I wrote the first music for it, and it took a lot of people to do. The Moog engineering staff did the electronics. We put about 16 to 1800 light bulbs in a matrix and turned them on and off with MIDI notes. One MIDI note could be any configuration. And there were 4 channels, of course, because just because you can make any configuration doesn't mean you don't have different time schemes. You like 2 against 3. You need to be able to have bars going this way and stars going up and down this way. So you had 4 MIDI channels, and then, of course, you had music MIDI channels. Now, MIDI is musical instrument digital interface, which allows us to, it allows us to communicate serially, one idea after another, and you can use this for anything you want. So the idea was immediate that we would use it for lights as well as, that was in the Guinness Book of World Records, 1987, misattributed, as everything is. It said that the Moog Company did the sound. The only thing that Occidental Chemical Company did was put up the conduit to run the wires. Now, I was there. As they say, success has many fathers, but Tom Rhea has the initial 5-page proposal. See? It's always nice when you have those things. Here's a group of instruments. I'm very sad to say they burned up. This was an exposition that was done in New York. Most of these instruments are gone. A friend came up that was part of this organization that we were doing. I'd been lugging them around all my life. He took them back to Cleveland, Tennessee, and his house promptly burned to the ground, and with a complete collection in it. Anon Martinoa, Trautonium, Raymond Scott's Clavivox, one of 3 in the world, and so forth. What can I tell you? I tried. I went to the Smithsonian. I told the Smithsonian 20 years ago, what are you guys doing? Look what's happening out here. No, they collected Archie Bunker's chair. Right. Oh, that's just indicating that I gained a lot of weight since then. That's it. Thank you. He's around. He's around. I saw him at Berkeley about 2.5 years ago, and he's got another company. He's doing something else. I'm meaning to go interview him. It's like so many things, it's kind of hard to get around to the things that are closest to you. Yeah. So if there's any questions, I suggest we sort of adjourn and let people mill out who want to, and then if you want to come up, kibitz or something, let's do that. Thanks very much. I really enjoyed it.